less than a handful of far-sighted officers extolled the virtues of aerial flight for Coast Guard operations as early as 1915. But the story of the elite corps of men and planes who followed actually started with the first group to be trained at Pensacola. Among them was 3rd Lieutenant Elmer F. Stone, the man destined to become Coast Guard Aviator Number 1. Coast Guard pilots made their mark in naval aviation right from the start, as young Lieutenant Stone, after serving in Europe in World War I as a naval aviator, was selected as one of the pilots of the Navy NC-4 flying boat, the only one of 3 such planes to complete the first transatlantic flight from Rockaway, Long Island to Lisbon, Portugal in 1919. A year later, the first Coast Guard air station was opened at Morehead City, North Carolina. A few daring young men flew 6 Curtiss HS-21 flying boats, borrowed from the Navy, to demonstrate the value of the airplane to the Coast Guard. But after 15 months of successful flying, the station was closed due to lack of money. In 1925, Coast Guard Aviator Number 6, Lieutenant Commander C.C. von Paulson, using another borrowed Navy plane, a Chance-Vought Model U-01, and operating from a borrowed base on 10-Pound Island, broke the back of the rum-running trade in the waters off Gloucester, Massachusetts. The success of the 10-Pound Island operations led to the first purchase of planes for the Coast Guard in 1926. 3 loaning amphibian biplanes with a top speed of 120 miles per hour. And 2 Vought U-04 single-float seaplanes. These planes were to become known as the scourge of the rum runners in ensuing years. Douglas became the first name in Coast Guard multi-engine planes, as 3 twin-engine amphibians were added to the fleet during 1931 and 1932. Little by little, almost plane at a time, daily surveillance, patrol, and search and rescue missions became an accepted fact. But it was not until 1933 that the first really modern and complete Coast Guard air station was opened at Dinner Key in Miami, Florida. And when World War II became a reality, Coast Guard planes and crews joined with the Navy in the protection of convoys, anti-submarine patrols, and search and rescue missions. Among the best recalled war stories is Chief Pilot Henry Clark White's sinking of the submarine U-166 in August of 1942. The first for a Coast Guard pilot. Or the fatal flights to Greenland's ice cap to rescue survivors of an Army Air Force B-17 bomber crew. After rescuing 2 injured men, Lieutenant John A. Pritchard and his radio man, Benjamin A. Bottoms, made a second flight to the ice cap, only to be lost in a raging snowstorm, trying to return a 3rd injured survivor to the cutter Northland. Just as the war spawned heroic deeds, it also gave birth to a new kind of flying machine, an almost unbelievable craft with no propeller, wings, or tail, but which could take off or land vertically, fly forward, backward, and sideways. It was called a helicopter. After considerable difference of opinion in high government offices as to its value, Coast Guard pilot number 32, Lieutenant Commander Frank A. Erickson, set about proving and improving the Sikorsky XR-4 and its successors. He developed and installed a hoist to pick up survivors from the water or vessels. With other pilots, he practiced landings and takeoffs from the Coast Guard's one and only aircraft carrier, the Governor Cobb, a merchant vessel converted for helicopter use. During water landings, flotation collars for the wheels were developed. By VE Day, Coast Guard pilots were flying PBY Catalinas, the famed black cats, in and out of Greenland fjords. Other Coast Guard crews were airlifting men and equipment in Curtiss R-5C Commandos and Douglas DC-3 Skytrains, making jet-assisted takeoffs in huge PBM seaplanes, using Grumman JRF-5 amphibians for the coastal patrols. Several B-17 Flying Fortresses were converted to boat-carrying search and rescue aircraft. A few B-24 Liberator bombers called PB-4Ys were flying long patrols and supplies as the Pacific War moved closer to Japan. At the war's end, career pilots literally stayed in their cockpits and flew their planes right into peacetime duty. For the Coast Guard, this included looking for new and better ways to turn war machines to humanitarian service. Like Coast Guard Aviator number 59, Commander Donald B. McDiarmid, who outlasted several seaplanes as he made hundreds of offshore landings to find the best way to ditch an airplane at sea. Tricky and dangerous flying that paid off in human lives saved in ensuing years. Or like Lieutenant Commander J.H. Schrader, Aviator number 102, whose tireless search located the crash site, then dropped food and medical supplies to survivors of an airliner crash in the Newfoundland wilderness. In a matter of hours, Coast Guard helicopters in New York and Elizabeth City were dismantled and loaded into cargo planes. Then flown to Gander Field, Newfoundland, reassembled, and used to ferry 18 survivors from the crash site to a nearby lake. From there, a Coast Guard PBY flew them out to Gander. As time passed, wartime planes were replaced by later models. In the early 1950s, a Grumman twin-engined amphibian known as the Albatross assumed the mainstay role in Coast Guard fixed-wing search and rescue and general utility flying. Some 20 years later, in the twilight of their career, these old workhorses were to be fitted with the first airborne oil surveillance system equipment, as the Coast Guard looked for better ways to locate and identify oil spills in coastal and near offshore waters. Pilots like Aviator number 500, Lieutenant Mitchell Perry, used them for everything from dropping emergency equipment to disabled boats or ships at sea, to delivering men, mail, and supplies to isolated stations from Alaska to Palau. Speaking of isolated places, Coast Guard helicopters operating from icebreakers in the early 50s gave pilots their first close look down into canyon-sized crevices of Greenland's great glaciers. In 1960, the first C-130, better known as the Hercules, came into Coast Guard service. Its huge payload and short landing and takeoff capabilities made it ideal for airlifting high-priority cargo. Its electronic search equipment and ability to fly low and slow on two engines made it a natural for long-range searches, or to crisscross thousands of square miles of North Atlantic Ocean on international ice patrol. To locate report, and sometimes bomb icebergs with colored dye to help keep track of them as they wander toward busy shipping lanes each spring and early summer. In the late 1960s, the C-130s joined in the fight against oil pollution, airdropping containment systems to offshore test spill sites. Later, carrying Coast Guard Strike Force teams and their equipment to spill areas everywhere from the Gulf of Mexico to the Straits of Magellan. During this time in 1965, another milestone was passed in Coast Guard flying history. Lieutenant Junior Grade Matthew J. Barber became aviator number 1000. And new Sikorsky HH-52A Sea Guard helicopters were coming into service. These gas turbine-powered flying lifeboats more than lived up to their names, making rescues of sick and injured sailors from ships at sea, plucking victims from roof and treetop in flood areas, and assisting thousands of pleasure boatmen from sinking, burning, or disabled boats. Their ability to operate from cutter flight decks extended their range to almost anywhere the ships could go. Capable of carrying a 3,000-pound payload, they were also assigned to polar icebreakers. The HH-3F's computerized navigational system makes it a natural for all-weather day and night flying. Its ability to search over 2,000 square miles without refueling gives new impetus to pollution detection and control operations. Provides helicopter versatility for offshore search and rescue incidents, and marine law and treaty enforcement, such as close surveillance of foreign fishing fleets. Today's planes are complex machines, and it takes some pretty special pilots to fly them. So they get special training at the Coast Guard Aviation Training Center. Students are already trained pilots, some with hundreds of hours of flight time in fixed-wing planes or helicopters. Here, they'll be trained for a particular type of plane or special operation. For example, special training for polar operations, flying from Coast Guard icebreakers in the Arctic and Antarctic, or transition from fixed-wing aircraft to helicopters. Neophyte airmen are taught by older and wiser heads, like Commander Lonnie L. Nixon, aviator number 878. A veteran not only of a couple of decades of Coast Guard flying, but also a year of Vietnam duty. And the equipment is as good as the instructors, including one of the best flight simulators in use today. Training is thorough, literally from the ground up. 1 or 2 weeks of instruction before the student pilot even sets foot in his new plane. On the ground and in the air, standardization is a byword at the center. Every pilot making every move in the same safety-proven way. Training runs the full gamut, from side-by-side instruction in the cockpit to develop the teamwork necessary to drop a life raft practically in the lap of a stranded boatman, to Arctic survival techniques at 30 to 60 below zero temperatures in the Eglin Air Force climatic hangar. This training may mean the difference between life and death on a polar ice pack at the top or bottom of the world. The young Coast Guard officers who first took to the air in a flying boat in